The Buckles Barometer, those of you who have been with us know what I'm talking about there. It's a working title. And also this Ordo Fide is my own creation. I haven't seen it anywhere. I looked it up. I tried to find where it may have been used before because it seems like a common phrase Latin phrase that would be used. It means order of faith. And the reason that I picked it is this Buckles Barometer, from the beginning to the end, is an order of faith. It's not Ordo Salutis exactly, but it is this order of faith, that how do you come to faith, how do you lead somebody to faith, how do you grow in faith, and then how do you help somebody else grow in faith. That's the idea. So it's all about this idea of, I live by faith. I no longer live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So that's an important part of this tool. And so it's just, and my goal is to have a tool, a one-page tool, just like if you watch football, you'll see this afternoon, these coaches have these big sheets and they got all the plays on it. And I thought, well, can we have all the plays for the Christian life on one sheet? That was my idea. So I don't have every resource on there. I'm just trying to find the best resources or ones that drive the point home so that it keeps it simple enough that we can understand. So let's move into the next phase. Now, between the last week and this week, I actually added one. So now we have a minus 15. If you'll remember, it was minus 14. Yeah, it's a growing thing. It's a kind of a dynamic tool here. And so the question is, we've dealt with why is there something rather than nothing? We've looked at the atheist. This time we're going to look at the agnostic, at agnosticism. Agnosticism simply is somebody who doesn't know. An atheist is someone who says, I know there is no God. The agnostic is the one who says, I don't know if there's a God. And it's important for us to understand, how do we address that? How do we address the agnostic, the person who simply doesn't know? And so if you'll notice that in the chart, and I've circled hard agnostic versus soft agnostic. And it's important to know these two types of agnosticism. So the hard kind of agnostic says you can't know. The soft kind says you simply don't know. And so the reason that it's important to understand that is if you're talking to somebody and they say, I'm agnostic, and you don't know that there's a distinction between the two, then it'll be muddled and you'll answer one type of agnostic and maybe they're the other type. And so you're asking the wrong questions of that person. So you want to make sure you understand where they are. One of the biggest important things of this chart is understanding that asking questions and finding out where the other person is so important, because if you don't know that, then you won't know how to answer their question. Or you'll answer their question and then you'll find out, that you've answered the wrong question. It's kind of like and I'm sure you've probably heard this one before, but about the kid comes up to mom and says, Mom, where did I come from? And she's like, all right, I guess so she tells the birds and the bees, story, right? And kind of gives her all of that. And after about, 30 minutes of understanding, the kid goes, no, you came from Boston. Where did I come from? And it was like, oops, wrong answer, right? Well, I think we do that with people in their faith. We assume that we know where they're coming from. We jump into a discussion with them, and they begin to kind of push back because, one, they're feeling disrespected. They feel like we don't understand them. They feel like we don't care because we haven't taken time to understand, and we're giving answers that they're shooting down, and it's not really addressing their issue. And so the purpose of this Buckles Barometer is you ask some questions, you figure out where they are on the barometer, and you know in your head what the distinctions are, and so you know where to address. So when you're talking to an agnostic, you want to know, is it the hard kind or the soft kind of agnostic? And so the hard kind is the person who said you can't know, right? Immanuel Kant. You notice I misspelled Kant. Immanuel Kant, now I'm going to get a little bit in, he had the noumenal and the phenomenal, right? And you're kind of like, okay, I already don't even know how to pronounce those words. Just stay with me. All I'm going to say on this slide is, he's basically saying the noumenal is the mind. In fact, my next slide puts these two Noumenon is an object or event that exists independently of the human senses. In other words, when you're dealing with the metaphysical issues like God or the soul or things you can't touch, taste, or feel, you're dealing with the noumenal or just the mind. The phenomenal refers to any object of the senses, of the five senses: touch, smell, taste. In fact, I think somebody said there's a sixth one, but sixth sense. But the five senses are those things which you can touch and taste and feel and smell, and so it's those things that he said that's what you can really know, and the other ones you can't. He actually wrote 2 books, the Critique of Pure Reason, which he's dealing with the noumenon, which is the mind, beyond the five senses. Then he wrote the Critique of Practical Wisdom, which is the five senses. And so there's so he toyed with these ideas, and he said, you can't know anything in this realm. You just can't know it. And in fact, he said, all knowledge begins with the senses. So which touch, taste, feel. And then he goes on to say nothing's higher than reason. And I was like, wait a minute, you've just said senses are higher than reason, so how can, and this is a quote of his, how can you say and so what he would say is anything that deals with the metaphysical, with God, with the soul, whatever, you just can't know. You just can't know. And so he has this idea of a thing in itself, and that is unknowable. God in himself is unknowable. The soul, you and yourself, are unknowable. I mean, there's certain things that he would say are unknowable. You just can't know them unless you can deal with the senses. That's why I was struggling with that question you asked last time: is can we base something on the evidence? Well, if it's only evidential, if it's only the senses and it's not reason, then it's got to be somehow both. And so we got to be careful. The cosmological argument can only take you so far because it does deal with the five senses. You see an effect, you're looking for a cause, right? And so there are some of the arguments that deal with that. The ontological argument, on the other hand, deals with reason as you wrestle with these issues. And so it's really important for us to kind of have in our mind these basic distinctions, because if we don't have them, these, and the thing is you're not going to get them all in this little one presentation, right? You're going to kind of get exposed to some things that you may have not seen before, and I think it's important for us to be exposed to it so we know where to begin to look. And it may be that when you're asked a question by one of your kids, by one of your friends, family members, or whatever, that you're able to go, oh, I remember we talked about that, and that deals with this, and there's a distinction I need to know, and so you go back and look at it, or you go back and ask a question about that, because now you know what questions to ask. One of the things that I found is that many times we don't know what questions to ask or who to ask them. I found that true of my mom when she was in the hospital. I went up and talked to one of her doctors, and I began to ask all these questions. And the doctor looked at me and just said, stop asking me these questions. I don't know the answers to them, or I can't give you the answers to these things. And just kind of pushed me off. And I said, ma'am, I've got to make life and death decisions for my mom. And I feel I'm not a doctor. And I don't know if I'm asking the right questions or who to ask them of. And I feel like I'm making these decisions in the dark. And then I just said, I'll stop asking, you questions or whatever. And I just walked over and sat down. And so she finished with my mom. She came back over, sat down and said, ask me anything you want to ask. Because she realized I wasn't there to attack her or to sue her or anything. I was just trying to figure out how can I make the best decision for my mom. The same thing's true spiritually. Sometimes we don't know if we're asking the right questions, what question, how do we ask the question, who are we asking the question of? And so one of the purposes of this presentation is to kind of expose you to some things that you may get some of it, you may not get all of it, but you'll know there's some deep answers in some of these areas that are really important for us to know exist. Because I'm convinced that so many people, and I've heard it, that people feel like there are no answers for the church because they never heard them in the church. And I think we need to talk about some of this kind of stuff. And this is kind of some of this stuff is the soft underbelly of our faith, And it's the stuff that's causing people to walk away because they think there are no answers. And so I know this is tough stuff, but stay with me on this because I think this is crucial stuff. So anyway, he says it's unknowable thing in itself. And this statement really helped me to kind of see what he's saying with that. He says, what might be said of things in themselves, separated from all our relationship to our senses, so there he goes back to the senses, remains for us absolutely unknown. I mean, he's making it very clear you can't know. You can't know, right? So if I were to draw a picture of his ideas, you have reality that you can know by the senses, and then you can't know anything about stuff that's the noumenon. You can know the phenomenon, but not the noumenon. You can know the reality, the things that we see here and now, and then there's this gulf between this and ultimate reality. I can't know God. I can't know if there's a God. I can't know if there's a heaven or a hell, and that's basically what he's saying. So if you evaluate that and you say, okay, how do I answer somebody if that's what they're thinking? Because I'll ask a person, that question, are you a hard agnostic or not? And they'll say, well, what is it? And so I'll explain what I just explained to you in simpler terms. But the question about this is, and it says for Kant, we can't know anything in the realm of ultimate reality or anything about God because it is not knowable in itself. Here's my question, and this is an important question to teach all your kids that they need to know. These are important questions. How do you know? We need to teach them to ask those kinds of questions. Now, just know, you teach them the question, they're going to say it to you. All right? I mean, the reason our kids say no is because we say no to them. That's where they learn to say no. And then now we're getting on to them for saying no, but they learned it from us. One of the things you have to realize is if you teach them, how do you know? One thing you've given them is an incredibly valuable tool. When they're in class, when they're in whatever, and somebody's spouting off something to them, and they're asking the question, how do you know? They're going to be seen as a troublemaker in class by asking that question. But that's the question they need to ask. How do you know? How do you know that? And so asking that question of this, he says you can't know, and I ask, how do you know? If you say you can't know, you're admitting that you know something about ultimate reality, the fact that you can't know anything about ultimate reality, right? And what that means is that Kant is claiming special knowledge that nobody else has. I mean, think about that. Special knowledge, when anybody says they have special knowledge that you don't have and you just need to trust them or what, you need to go, why? How do I know? I mean, those are key questions. Who, what, when, where, why, right? How do you know that? How do you know that you can't know? And so it's self-defeating. Because he's saying, I know something about ultimate reality. The fact that you can't know anything, well, what else can you know about ultimate reality? If he says that there's an ability to know that. And so it's ultimately self-defeating and it fails. And so here's my question that I ask. What do you ask the hard kind of agnostic? Do you know everything? Same question that you ask the agnostic, right? I mean, the atheist. Because you want to know if they're saying you can't know, do you know everything? Well, no, I don't know everything. Well, then how do you know that? How do you know you can't know if you don't know everything? Because you'd have to know everything to say you can't know. And so it goes back to the simple illustration, right? If there was a pen in the room. That was the illustration we used before. Whenever I share this with anybody and I'm sitting there talking to them, I just use whatever small object. You don't want to say TV, well, everybody can see the TV. You can't hide it anywhere. But a spoon or a pen or napkin or something, if I were to say there's no pen in this room, I'd have to know everything what's in your pockets, your purses. I'd have to know what's under the carpet, behind the wall, baseboards. I'd have to know everything about the room to be able to say there absolutely categorically is no pen in this room. I would have to say the same, that's the atheist. I would have to say the same thing if I said, you can't know if there's a pen in the room. Well, how do you know that? You don't know that. There could be a pen in the room that there's part of the room that you don't know anything about. And so it's really the same question. So now keep these questions in mind. We're going to talk about them at the end. I'm going to give a quiz at the end, okay? And I want you to, because I want to help you with that process of verbalizing what you believe. And so, do you know everything? And that's the question. Now, the soft kind of agnostic simply says you don't know. That's exactly where you actually want somebody to be a soft agnostic, where they're simply saying, I don't know. And they're not cynical, because it's easy to be a cynical, soft agnostic, where you're cynical about everything. In fact, usually if you're in agnosticism, you're going to be cynical. Atheism, you're going to be cynical. And what that means is you're just going to attack anything, and you attack it with questions. And so when you're talking to somebody who's in that position, they're going to be asking you all sorts of questions. And what does that do? It puts you on the defensive, and it puts them on the offensive. And it's harder to be on the defensive because now you're always having to come up with an answer. And the questions are easy to come by. Anybody can be cynical. Anybody can ask the hard questions. But what you want to do is you want to create an environment where the hard questions are being asked, but it's not you on the defensive, not necessarily even them on the defensive. You want it to be where you're both wrestling with the issues together. That's the ideal situation. What we typically do is get in this argument, that's where quarrels start, about these issues is all of a sudden I'm asking you a question, you're asking me a question, and the heat goes up, and now we're asking them louder and standing up or whatever, and pointing at each other, and it's like, no, we don't want to go there. But one of the things that you can learn to do is just learn to ask questions yourself. And when you ask these questions, do you know everything? I always preface it. It's how you set it up that's really important. If I just come out with the question, then it's an attack and it's an affront to them. But if I say, hey, I don't mean this question to be sarcastic or in any way attacking, I simply am asking this question for sake of discussion. Well, now I've set it up and they're ready for the question. In fact, they're interested. Okay, what question are you going to ask? And so then I say, do you know everything? Now, sometimes, and I've asked that question to some, and they're just kind of on the sarcastic mode, or they're in a different mode than I am. I'm wanting to get at truth, and they're just kind of wanting to make fun of me, in front of myself. And so they'll say, "Yeah, I know everything," because you'll have some people that will do that, right? In fact, I would be kind of that guy probably as an unbeliever. In fact, I was that guy, and so because I know they're maybe setting me up. And so I've had people say, yeah, I know everything. And they'll say, well, that means you're God, but you don't look like I thought you would. And then they laugh, but what it does is it keeps the discussion going. You say, no, really, this is an important issue. And so you're able to get back into the issue, and it's important that we wrestle with these things and know how to address them and how to keep the discussion going, because what we'll typically do is we'll just go, boom, here's what I believe. Take it or leave it. And discussion over. And guess what they're going to do? Leave it. They're not going to want anything to do with what. And so it's like, no, you don't want to create that. You want to create something where they're beginning to wrestle with some of the issues honestly and have an honest. And so one of the things that I'll ask a agnostic is, in fact, we're all agnostic. Deuteronomy 29:29 says, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and our children forever. And so there are some things God holds for himself that we're agnostic about. And so it's okay to be agnostic about some things, not about God and his existence, but to be agnostic about things that God hasn't shown us, revealed to us, or whatever. And so there is an aspect of it where we all have a certain amount of agnosticism. But the question that I'll ask them is are you open-minded? Now, that's a thing that when you ask somebody, everybody wants to be open-minded, right? Or not everybody. Some people go, no, I'm not open-minded at all. But this idea of, are you open-minded? Are you open to discussing truth? And you can follow that up, and so it's important to ask that question so that you can have a healthy and good discussion with them. Now, one of the things that I found, and there's a book out that came out in 1987. It was by a guy named Alan Bloom. He was a University of Chicago professor. He was not conservative, although some people accused him of that. He was not a conservative. And he wrote this book that was a New York Times bestseller, was on the bestseller list for 4 weeks in a row. It was called The Closing of the American Mind. And he said, all is not well in America or in the university. And this was a review that I read. And Bloom offers a profound and compelling diagnosis of the common illnesses affecting them both. That illness involves the crisis of the West, which is fundamentally a crisis of reason. The loss of confidence in reason's ability to discover truth and to guide human action. That was his proposal. That was his thesis of his book. Now, this next one really made me realize how prophetic that book was in 1987. Because he said, the loss of reason and nature as standards leaves people passionately committed to their values with no means to evaluate these values or negotiate their differences. And we see that all the time. It's on Facebook, it's on social media, where people are espousing views, making statements, but they don't really know how to involve in dialogue. They don't know how to defend that view rationally, and they just say, that's what I believe. And you believe whatever you want to believe, I believe whatever I want to believe, which means it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter if I have a reason. And it's into fideism, it's into, which is just believing because you believe it and not because you have any rational reason to defend it. And so it's important for us to understand that's where our world is. And so when people say that they're open-minded, there is a fallacy of an open-mindedness. And the fallacy is that, in fact, he says there's an openness that denies the special claim of reason. And you think openness that denies, those don't seem like they should go together. How can you say you're open, but then have denial at the same time? And so the fallacy is those who claim to be open-minded are closed-minded, actually. A person will say, I'm open-minded, and then you say, oh, really? I'm a conservative. They go, well, I don't like what you hold. Oh, so you are closed-minded. That was one of the main premises of his book, is that there is no open-minded position, ultimately. So anytime you talk to somebody and you ask them if they're open-minded, you've got to understand there is a fallacy of open-mindedness that if you don't understand that, you'll wonder, why are you still closed-minded when you say you're open-minded? And so there's that fallacy of the open-minded position. So you want to have a person where they're this open-minded agnostic, but they're open-minded in the sense that they're willing to talk. They're willing to dialogue. They're willing to discuss. That's where you want to get somebody, because you don't want to just do a hit and run, which so many times we do in the Christian life. We're taught how to share our faith, or we're taught how to have apologetics and defend our faith. And so we just hit them with the blast, and we walk away. No, this is a conversation. This is a relationship you're building. And just know this, truth travels along a relational bridge. It always does. And if you don't have that relationship that you're building and the person feels that you care about them as a person, no matter what they believe, they're not going to be open to whatever it is you believe. They're not going to be open to whatever you have to share with them. And so when you, but what I've also found is if they're asking all the questions and you're not asking the questions of them, then they think that you are just hearing about it for the first time. They're surprised when you ask questions. Like whenever I began to ask questions of different people and say, well, how do we know anything exists? How do you know that if I close that door, everything doesn't disappear? And they go, oh, wow, this guy's actually thoughtful. You know, maybe he's asking some of these questions that I've been asking. And so if I ask them first, they think that. If they ask them first, if I wait for them to ask those questions when I perceive that maybe that's where they are, then they think I've never heard those questions before. And then I'm all on the defensive. But when I ask them that question, they go, oh, yeah, I've wondered about that myself. Do you have an answer for it? Because I've been looking for one. No, I don't have one. Well, let me tell you what I've figured out. And now you're having this great discussion going back and forth. It's casual. It's meaningful. And when they walk away, they go, oh, wow, I want to talk about that some more. And that's exactly where you want them. Because now you've got them at an agnostic position. They're open-minded. They're willing to talk. And you have the relational bridge on which truth can travel, and you begin to build this relationship. And it means it takes time. You've got to be committed to it, and not that they're a project that you're doing. They become your friend. And that it's a two-way street. There's going to be things that you learn from them. When I met the guy named Steve, in my at college, and I began to share Christ with him. And he was a Jewish, probably agnostic, I think, philosophy major at that time. When I began to talk to him, I learned a lot from just the questions that he asked, because I hadn't thought about some of the questions he was asking, stuff he was learning in classes. And I was a music major. I didn't know any philosophy. And so it was a real growing experience for me. So just know if it becomes that two-way street where you come back and say, I've been thinking about what you said, well, then they feel like what they're saying is valuable to you. And so you want to put it all together, right? You want to have this relationship where you're beginning to talk. So one of the things that, and I just, in fact, I remembered another story too, but I think I told y'all last time about the guy who got in my space and said, "You're a pastor, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "I'm an atheist." Well, how do you go from there? What do you say to that? Of course, my first thought was, so do you want to take it outside and, settle this like a couple of men? Or, because it was like he was ready for a fight. And he had the chip on his shoulder, and he was like, knock it off, if you can. And so, and that's the way it started. And I thought, I need to diffuse this right away. If I'm going to have any kind of conversation, I didn't know this guy. And so I just leaned back and I smiled at him and I said, I got a question for you. And you know what question I asked him? What was it? Yeah, do you know everything? I said, I don't mean this question to be sarcastic or create an argument or thing. I think for sake of discussion, I asked him the question. He hesitated, and he goes, no, I don't. And I said, then you can't be an atheist. And then I gave the illustration. I picked up a spoon at that point. I said, if I were to say there was no spoon in this room, I would have to know everything about this room. But to be able to say that there's a spoon, theism, I don't have to know everything about this room. All I have to know is where the spoon is. So I don't have to know everything to be a theist. You have to know everything to be an atheist. And so then I said, so at best you can be as an agnostic. And I said, are you the hard kind or the soft kind? He goes, I don't know. What's the difference? And I said, well, the hard kind says you can't know. The soft kind says you don't know. And he says, I'm the hard kind. Okay. I said, so, there was a guy named Immanuel Kant, and usually people know that guy's name. I said, Kant said you can't know, and, haha. And so, yeah, you're seeing where this is going, right? And so then I said, Kant said you can't know anything about ultimate reality, but that's self-defeating. And so the question that I have for you as a hard agnostic is, do you know everything? And so he said, no. And so I said, then you can't be a hard kind of agnostic. You can only be the soft agnostic. It simply says you don't know. I said, would you like to talk about it? And he goes, yes, I would. Now, I knew this guy from earlier. I had information on him that he was Catholic. And so if I would have approached him as a Catholic with my understanding of theology, then I would have approached some different issues. I would have approached maybe works salvation, or I would have approached 7 sacraments, or some other issues, right? But because I asked him questions, or because he started out the conversation with atheism, I still had to ask questions. And I found, I kind of walked him through to agnosticism. And then I began to say, how do we know anything is true? So now you know where I'm going, right? I went from the next to the bottom rung, minus 14, atheism. I went to minus 13, agnosticism. And then I jumped down to 15. And why did I do that? Because I knew with this guy, I need to establish, how do we know what's true? So then I asked, how do we know there's something rather than nothing? And so what's the answer to that? Because something has always been. That's how we know there's something rather than nothing. So that's the answer. And so what you'll find is on the barometer, I have some of those just simple statements. Because we've got to be able to know them simply. You may not know all the ins and outs of it that I've shown you, but to know, I know there's something rather than nothing because something has always existed because I exist. And it's the question of undeniability that we looked at a couple of times ago, that because I exist, I think, therefore I am. René Descartes was right. Because I exist, what do I know about myself? There's not an infinite regress of causes. And this is what I was explaining to you. There can't be an infinite regress of causes. I know that because I exist and I'm limited, and that's where what you said last time, that question of, yeah, you do learn some things from what is. You look at yourself and you want to know, what do I know about myself? I'm limited and finite. Something else caused me to be. I haven't always existed. So I've just proven my parents and their parents, and so they're not infinite regressive causes. There had to be a first cause, and that cause is either intelligent or not. And if I use my watchmaker argument, which I used with this guy, I said, hey, if I were to, I'd take off my watch and lay it there, and I said, if I found this watch, and I were to look at that, and I were to say, what caused that to be, I could say, well, there was a little explosion there. Evolution, right? I could say that it's this just energy. It doesn't really exist. It's just energy, and it's going to go back to, or I can say something intelligent caused this watch to be. And if it's an Apple Watch, then I know that there's information, there's time, there's language. I know that there's an ability with plastics, with energy storage, and so I would posit intelligent design. And I would also posit that whatever caused this to be had the ability to cause it to be. And then when I look at myself and realize I have personality, the watch doesn't have personality, but I even have personality, so whatever caused me to be had to be personal as well, then I've just demonstrated a designer that is intelligent, that has always been, that has personality. I've just proven God in a rational sense, that it makes, and I say prove in quote marks, because I can't show you God. I can't show him to you. That step has to be taken by faith. All these arguments do is bring somebody to belief that, not to belief in. And so the other illustration that I thought of was I had a professor named Norman Geisler. You'll hear me mention his name. He and Hendricks had a lot of influence on my life. Those two professors. Norman Geisler said that he was listening to a presentation by the guy who was the head of EE, D. James Kennedy, and his EE is Evangelism Explosion. He gets up in chapel in this Bible college that he was at, and he challenged everybody to get out and share their faith. And so, he said, if you're going to do that, he said, with every head bowed, right? And you have everybody, well, every head's not bowed when that happens. There's people that just look. And so the professors are sitting up on stage. And so and the podium's here, all the professors here, and then the audience are the students. Well, he said, if you're going to share your faith this week, raise your hand. Well, he's sitting there thinking, Norman Geisler, he was honest with us. He said, he knows students peak. And so he raised his hand, right? Because out of, a little bit of pressure, peer pressure. So, the 2 weeks came and went, and he didn't share his faith. And he was feeling very convicted he had given his word that he would do something. So he grabs a student and said, come on, we're going to go knock on a door, and, I'm going to share my faith, with somebody because I said I would. So he knocks on the door. He knocks on this door, and this guy comes to the door. And he says, we're talking to people about, Jesus, and I have a question for you I'd like to ask. And the guy says, sure, go ahead. And he says, if God were to ask you, why you were standing at the door of heaven, and God would ask you, or the gate of heaven, and God would ask you, why should I let you into my heaven? What would you tell him? He said, well, I'd tell him, why shouldn't you let me in? And Geisler goes, that wasn't one of the two answers that D. James Kennedy said that people would answer. They would either answer because of Jesus or because of works. And this was a question out of Geisler was a pretty brilliant man, so he ad-libbed at that point, and he says, if I were to ask you, I'm standing here at your door, and I were to ask you, why shouldn't you let me in? What would you tell me? He said, I'd tell you where to go. And so he said, yeah, that's what God would tell you. Whoa. The guy realized that he had a smarter than average person standing at his door, so he invites them in. And they began to go through this process. And the guy said he was an atheist, and so Geisler asked him, do you know everything? And he said, no. And so what you find is as you're asking these questions, and Geisler walked him through the open-minded agnostic, but then he realized that his issue was not, he didn't have to step through every step thinking his way through. He knew this is the issue that he has. He gave him a book on it's like Who Moved the Stone or one of those books. And the guy read the book, and he came back a couple of weeks later, and the guy accepted Christ. Here was a guy that started out in this atheistic position, kind of sarcastic, not wanting to really answer, but he realized that he had a guy that was willing to dialogue with him that knew something, and all of a sudden he was interested, and he began to desire to know more. And so when we think about these issues, we need to ask ourselves the question when we're talking to somebody, have we asked enough questions? Have we asked the questions that will help us to understand? Because the guy that I asked the question of that came up to me and said, you're a pastor, I'm an atheist. I talked to him for about 2 hours. And as I talked to him, one of the things that I realized is he wasn't an atheist, he wasn't an agnostic even. He was a pantheist. A pantheist is somebody who believes that all things are God, that you're God, I'm God, the chairs are part of God, the carpet, the building, the birds, everything's part of God, and everything's connected together, and there is a one God, so they have one God, but we're all a part of it, and when we die, we just kind of blend in. It's like electricity. If we just became electricity at the end of our life and then we just kind of blended in, no personality, no individuality, and all of a sudden we're just part of the electricity, part of the force of the universe. And I realized that's where he was. And so as I asked him, I says, I don't think you're an atheist, I think you're a pantheist. And he goes, what's that? And so I explained to him what I just explained to him. He goes, yeah, that's what I believe. I said, where did you learn that? He said, from some Jesuit priests. Wow. Catholic priests taught him pantheism. He thought he was an atheist, and he came out of a Catholic background. If I would have approached any of those directly, I would have missed him completely. But because I stayed in the conversation, I explained to him what he was, and I began to talk to him about that, and about why I didn't hold to pantheism. I used the intelligent design discussion or arguments. We had a great conversation for those 2 hours, and I was able to even go to the point of sharing my testimony about how I came to Christ. And when he got done, he didn't accept Christ then, but I heard him tell his sister, I want to talk to that guy again. And what that communicated to me was, one, he felt respected enough. Two, that he enjoyed the conversation because I made it a dialogue and not a monologue. And three, because I had something that was meaningful to him that he was interested in, and I was answering the real questions that he had. And so as we think through this, I think it's important for us to understand and be able to just give those simple arguments, those simple things. And in fact, as I talked to you last time, I want to encourage you again this week to take some time and just discuss with somebody else. How would you answer this? How would you answer an atheist? Maybe ask the same question that was asked of me to someone, or to say, hey, if you were to ask me this, here's how I think I would answer. And then let them ask whatever questions. Let them kind of attack your position, because that's where you figure it out. Is when people, where I learned this stuff was I was still sharing my faith on UTA campus with students. I was helping out with Pantego Bible churches, and now it's called Central Bible Church. I was helping out with their college ministry, and I was taking guys and we were sharing our faith on campus. And so I was beginning to use some of these things to dialogue with these students. And so I was saying it over and over, and I'd get it wrong, and I'd get it, goofed up, and yet these guys were patient with me as I talked to these students, but I found that they were interested in what I had to say.